My fiancée was in love with a misunderstood genius. She was so infatuated that she was willing to cut ties with her wealthy parents just to follow a penniless writer. She firmly believed her great artist was simply a victim of bad timing, and that one day he would win a Pulitzer or land on the bestseller list. 10 years have passed now, and the man hasn't even managed to get a short story published in a local newspaper. My ex-fiancée, Summer Harrison, was obsessed with those romantic indie movies and starving artist tropes. You know the ones. A struggling writer meets a billionaire's daughter, or a socialite abandons her trust fund for true love. She devoured these stories until she was practically drunk on them, believing every word. She felt that life should be just like a screenplay, full of dramatic pivots and romance that transcended tax brackets. I used to tease her about it constantly. My dear Summer, I'd say, 9 out of 10 of those starving artists are just lazy grifters. The 10th one actually has talent, but is destined to be miserable. Wake up. She would always pout and shoot back. Ethan, you're just too cynical. Real love is about seeing past the superficial world. Phoenix. Arguing with a girl brainwashed by Nicholas Sparks novels was a total waste of my breath. I figured once we got married and she had to deal with the complexities of high society galas, charity boards, and managing a household, she'd realize that a solid prenup and a reliable husband were a lot more practical than artistic passion. The turning point happened at a high-end literary salon. It was a beautiful spring afternoon, and a few of the city's prominent intellectuals had organized a poetry reading at one of my family's estate gardens. Summer had begged to come, claiming she wanted to inhale the scent of ink and soul. I couldn't say no, so I brought her along. The event started off, predictably enough, a bunch of self-important academics and aspiring writers patting each other on the back. I sat at the head table, playing the role of the rising political star, offering the occasional polished critique to maintain my image. Summer sat beside me, her eyes wide and admiring at first, though she eventually started to look bored as the afternoon dragged on. That was when a man in a faded thrift store denim jacket stood up. His name was Chase Miller. He came from nothing, had spent a decade finding himself, and hadn't earned a dime from his writing. Usually at events like this, he was just background noise. But today was different. His face was pale, yet his eyes burned with a strange, almost arrogant intensity. He walked to the center of the patio, gave a curt nod to the crowd, and spoke in a booming voice. Ladies and gentlemen, on this fine day, I have a modest piece I've titled The Great River's Lament. I'd appreciate your thoughts. I was just taking a sip of my iced tea. When I heard the title, I nearly choked. Chase took a deep breath and began a performance that would have put a Broadway actor to shame. Do you not see the waters of the Mississippi, falling from the heavens, surging to the sea, never to return? Do you not see the mirrors in the great halls, mourning the silver hair that was silk at dawn and snow by dusk? His voice rose and fell with practiced rhythm. He had presence, I'll give him that. The sheer bravado of the lines was undeniable, and it stunned half the people there. Some of the younger guests were nodding along, looks about plastered on their faces. I even heard someone whisper, "This is visionary. This isn't just poetry. It's a revelation." Summer was even worse. Her face was flushed, her hands were clutching her silk scarf, and she couldn't take her eyes off the man center stage. She had the same look in her eyes that my father gets when he sees a favorable poll, pure, unadulterated heat. I, however, felt nothing but a desire to laugh. Buddy, if you're going to plagiarize, at least try a little harder. You could have at least picked something obscure so the cracks wouldn't show. Sure enough, when Chase reached the part about the great kings of old, feasting at the Palace of Peace, where wine flowed like the tides, a retired professor known for his encyclopedic knowledge of history cleared his throat. "Mr. Miller," the professor said, frowning. "Forgive me. My geography might be failing me, but where exactly is this Mississippi you speak of? I've studied every map of our territory, and I don't recall a river by that name in this entire region." The question hit like a bucket of ice water. The patio went dead silent. The bravado on Chase's face froze. A flicker of panic crossed his eyes. "Well, the Mississippi. It's a metaphor from a dream I had. It represents a vast, turbulent force, symbolizing the flow of time." It was a weak explanation, and even I felt embarrassed for him. But it didn't stop there. A younger student spoke up curiously. "And what about the Palace of Peace and the kings of the Golden Age? Our history books don't mention any such dynasty. Who were you referring to?" The questions started coming fast. Chase's forehead began to bead with sweat. He opened his mouth to explain, but the words wouldn't come. It was a total social train wreck. I could almost feel his internal cringe as he stood there in the middle of the elite crowd. I set my glass down and cleared my throat, deciding to join the fun. Mr. Miller is clearly gifted. The imagery is powerful. However, I'm also a bit confused. You mentioned slaughtering the fatted calf for a feast and spending 1,000 gold pieces that will surely return. In today's economy, that's quite a bold lifestyle. May I ask what you do for a living, Chase? The fact was, he wasn't even an adjunct professor. He was flat broke. Writing lines about treating gold like dirt while being unable to pay rent was hilariously tone-deaf. A wave of suppressed snickers rippled through the crowd. No one there was an idiot. They had been momentarily swept up by the rhythm, but now the logical holes were gaping wide. Chase stood there, face turning from red to white, trapped. That was when a voice I never expected rang out, filled with indignation. You're all just jealous. You're trying to tear him down. Every head in the place turned toward my fiancée. Summer stood up, her chest heaving with emotion, her face bright red. She pointed a finger at the questioners, myself included, her voice trembling. Chase's poem is profound. It's a masterpiece. You don't care about the soul or the philosophy. You're just nitpicking details. Who cares about the name of a river or a palace? It's about the feeling. It's art. You're all just narrow-minded. You spent too much time reading textbooks and not enough time living. She looked directly at me for the final blow. You're all blinded by your own privilege. I was stunned. Truly, I watched her face, glowing with the thrill of defending another man. I saw the way she looked at Chase, with blatant admiration, sympathy, and something dangerously close to worship. In that second, it clicked. It was the classic romantic movie trope happening in real life. The wealthy girl falls for the misunderstood artist, convinced that everyone trying to stop her, including her stuffy fiancé, is just a villain representing the oppressive establishment. I didn't even feel angry. I felt a surge of pure, absurd amusement. This girl is too far gone. She didn't just believe the plagiarized poem. She was completely intoxicated by the rebel energy this hack was putting off. At that moment, only one thought screamed in my head. I need to break this off. Right now. Why would I want a woman whose head is filled with romantic bubbles, who can't tell reality from a screenplay, and who might cheat on me the moment a tortured soul walks by? I'm Ethan Sterling. I'm the son of the district attorney. I can have anyone. Why keep a liability whose heart has already checked out? I looked at her, my expression blank. No anger, no argument. I simply turned to a nearby server and said quietly, "Please escort Miss Harrison to her car. She seems to be overwhelmed." Summer glared at me, likely expecting me to blow up or beg her to sit down. My calm indifference seemed to infuriate her even more. She stamped her foot, her eyes welling with tears. "Ethan, I see you for who you really are now. You're just like the rest of them. You're shallow. You're a bore." With that, she turned and sprinted out of the garden. I didn't get up. I didn't call after her. I didn't even offer an explanation. I watched her back disappear and thought, go ahead, go cry to your father. I'm putting the breakup paperwork on the fast track. The salon fell apart after that, ending awkwardly. Later that night, I sent my assistant to do a deep dive on Chase Miller. The report confirmed everything. Chase, 22, parents deceased, living in a studio apartment, surviving on odd jobs and ghostwriting. Academically average, he'd failed several entry-level certifications. But about 10 days ago, he'd nearly drowned in a lake. After being hospitalized, he'd emerged a different person. He wasn't quiet or timid anymore. He was loud, arrogant, and constantly crashing events to recite revolutionary poetry that was stylistically all over the place. Sometimes epic, sometimes romantic, but always filled with references to places and people that didn't exist. "Sir, this guy Miller, it's like he's possessed," my assistant, Leo, reported cautiously. I waved him off. "He's not possessed. He's enlightened," I added internally. "He's been replaced by a soul from another world. Too bad for him. He didn't bring a full brain with him. If you're going to plagiarize, at least localize the material." He didn't change a single name or place. He just moved the references wholesale. It was a neon sign screaming that something was wrong. This world has no Mississippi. Its history and culture are completely different from whatever world he came from. And he thought he could just copy-paste? This guy's IQ was so low he might as well give up on any professional career. He probably couldn't even pass a basic citizenship test. A few days later, Summer actually came to see me. She'd been fighting with her father, Arthur Harrison. Arthur was a shrewd businessman. There was no way he'd let his daughter throw away a perfectly good alliance to run off with a penniless hack. She was here to negotiate or vent. She stood in my office, her eyes puffy from crying, but her voice was steady. "Ethan, I have to ask. You know Chase is a genius, don't you? I didn't even look up from the documents I was signing. I gave a dry laugh. A genius? Geniuses get recruited by top firms or win awards. At 22, he hasn't even passed his bar exam or landed a job. You call that a genius? Those poems of his are full of holes. He's just a con artist playing a role for girls like you. You, Summer hissed. How can you be so stubborn? Chase is a diamond in the rough. His talent is beyond the comprehension of people like you, who only care about status and money. I put my pen down and looked at her, my eyes full of pity. Oh, not comprehended by society? Summer, you talk a big game about transcending the superficial, but do you realize that the designer clothes you're wearing, the gourmet meals you eat, and the trust fund that pays your bills are all part of that superficial world? Without them, your precious Chase couldn't even afford to feed you, let alone talk about poetry and life's ideals. I stood up and walked over to her, looking down at her. I know what you're thinking, but for the sake of our family's long friendship, let me give you some advice. The Harrison family spent generations building their empire. Think about your parents before you do something impulsive. Stop living in a fantasy. Otherwise, the consequences will be more than you or your family can handle. My tone was calm, but it carried a weight of authority. Summer was momentarily cowed, but then the courage she'd gathered from her romance novels took over. She lifted her chin like a tragic heroine. Ethan, don't try to intimidate me. For true love, I'm not afraid of anything. I'm calling off the engagement. I'd rather eat dirt with Chase than live in this gilded cage with a corporate drone like you. I smiled. I was actually so annoyed, I started laughing. A corporate drone? Fine. Good for you. I nodded and called out to the reception area. Security, show Miss Harrison out. 2 guards entered and politely but firmly escorted her toward the elevator. Summer looked at me with a mix of anger and disappointment. She probably expected me to beg her or get into a shouting match. My cold indifference made her even more furious. She stomped her foot, her eyes reddening. Ethan Sterling, I was wrong about you. You're just a common, boring man. Ordinary. She turned and marched away, her back stiff with resolve. I shook my head. You can't save someone who's determined to jump off a cliff. This girl was living in a dream, desperate to star in her own rich girl leaves it all for love drama. And I, apparently, was the villain who cared about money and status. Fine. If that's the role she wanted me to play, I'd play it. I went back to my desk and opened a new email. I needed to draft the formal termination of the engagement. I had to be careful with the wording. I wanted it to be clear that the Sterling family was the one walking away, so nobody could say we were being bullied. It had to look reasonable. Ideally, putting the blame on Summer's erratic behavior and lack of moral standing. My father was the district attorney. We had an image to maintain. As for the reincarnated Chase Miller, I was actually looking forward to it. A genius who couldn't even plagiarize correctly, paired with a spoiled girl who didn't know how to boil an egg. In the real world, how long would their true love last against the reality of monthly bills? I could already see the comedy special writing itself. I just had to grab some popcorn and wait for the show. I was actually a little excited. The idea of the breakup took root and started growing like a weed in spring. But I couldn't be the one to rush it. I had to wait for the perfect moment. Wait for her to burn her own bridges. The opportunity arrived just 3 days later. The Moonlight Lounge, the most prestigious club in the city, was having its grand reopening after a massive renovation. It used to be a dive bar called the Crimson Rose, but had been bought out, rebranded, and was now the place to be. They brought in some of the top performers from New York, including the new it girl of the cabaret scene, Lydia Rose. Rumor had it Lydia was from a fallen political family, highly educated and talented, forced into the nightlife by tragedy. That kind of tragic backstory plus beauty was catnip for the intellectual crowd. Naturally, every socialite and politician in the city was there for the opening, including me. In our circle, skipping an event like this was a social faux pas. I arrived with a few of my friends, looking the part of the successful heir. The club was stunning. Velvet curtains, crystal chandeliers, and the scent of expensive perfume. We were led to a VIP table right at the front. I'd barely taken a sip of my drink when I spotted a familiar, annoying figure. Guess who? Our great talent, Chase Miller, was there. He was still wearing that same denim jacket, looking wildly out of place among the suits and cocktail dresses. Nobody wanted to sit with him, so he had a tiny corner table to himself. He sat there with his back straight, looking at everyone with that "you're all beneath me" sneer. My friend Mark, whose family owned a major textile firm and who loved to stir the pot, let out a loud snort. Wow, I didn't know the lounge lowered its dress code. Any bum can wander in now. Chase's face darkened. He looked over at us, his eyes landing on me. He probably figured I was the ringleader. He scoffed. What? Does this place only allow silver spoon brats? Can't a real thinker enjoy a night out? A thinker? Mark laughed. Chase, do you even have a degree? You aren't even an intern. How do you even call yourself a thinker? You probably had to crowdfund the cover charge. That hit a nerve. Chase's face went scarlet. Small minds can't comprehend greatness. Fame is just a shadow to me. One day, I'll be on top of the world. I nearly spit out my drink. Seriously? He was quoting classic revolutionary lines again, but in this context, it was just pathetic. He hadn't even climbed the small hill of a steady job, yet he was talking about the mountaintop. Before the argument could escalate, the club manager rushed over to play peacemaker. After all, it was opening night. Then the main event began. The madam of the house, now the elegant manager, stepped onto the stage. She announced that to celebrate Lydia Rose's first night, Lydia would grant a private audience to the guest who could produce the best original poem or prose dedicated to the Moonlight Lounge. The room buzzed. Getting a private audience with Lydia Rose wasn't just about her beauty. It was a massive status symbol. My friend started nudging me. Ethan, go for it. Show that loser what a real education looks like. I smiled but stayed quiet. I was going to participate, but I had to keep it classy. I looked over at Chase. His eyes were shining with confidence. The Plagiarist was about to go back online. Sure enough, as people began submitting short verses and toasts, it was finally Chase's turn. He took a deep breath and walked to the center of the room. He looked around like he was delivering a State of the Union address, not trying to impress a cabaret singer. I have a piece, he announced. A prose poem titled The Manifesto of the Heights. The Manifesto of the Heights. It was a legendary piece of literature from another world. My jaw tightened. Buddy, you're completely off topic. This was a lounge, not a historical landmark. At least change the title. Chase began his passionate recitation. In this ancient county of Yuchong, this new city of Hongdu, under the stars of the southern sky. The second he started, I knew he was in trouble. What the hell was Yuchong? Where was Hongdu? He was talking about celestial alignments that made no sense to anyone in this hemisphere. Predictably, after a few sentences, whispers broke out in the crowd. Yuchong? Hongdu? Where's that? Is that a fictional world? An old professor in the back muttered. 3 rivers and 5 lakes. The barbarians of the north. What is he talking about? The jewel of the heavens? The legend of the bed of Suru? Who is Suru? The questions kept coming, even more frequent than at the garden party. Chase's recitation became stilted. He started sweating. He even messed up the rhythm, making some of the lines sound clunky and weird. He reached the famous line about the sunset and the solitary bird flying together, but he delivered it with zero emotion, completely killing the beauty of the original. I laughed internally. This guy had just memorized the word without understanding the meaning or the flow. He was relying on the brilliance of the original author to carry him, but he couldn't even do that right. It worked on a naive girl like Summer, but it wasn't working on this crowd. Despite the logical flaws, the sheer power of the original prose was still impressive. Some people started defending him. Maybe he's using archaic names or a fantasy setting. Maybe we're just not well read enough. Yeah, the vocabulary alone is incredible. But those defenses felt weak against the mountain of contradictions. I noticed Lydia Rose, watching from behind a sheer curtain, give a slight shake of her head. It was my turn. I stood up perfectly composed. I had written a piece titled The Moonlight Overture. I didn't copy anything. I used my actual education to write a sophisticated piece that combined the atmosphere of the club with the history of the city. It was elegant, the metaphors worked, and most importantly, every reference was real. No Mississippi, no Yuchan. When I finished, the room erupted in genuine applause. Even the people who had been defending Chase had to admit that my piece was polished, appropriate, and flawless. Finally, Lydia Rose's voice came from behind the curtain. She announced that Mr. Ethan Sterling's Moonlight Overture was the winner. I don't accept this. Chase yelled, jumping to his feet. His face was twisted with rage. He pointed at me. My manifesto is a masterpiece of the ages. How could it lose to his mediocre trash? This place is rigged. He was a sore loser. The club security didn't even wait for orders. They moved in, grabbed the shouting Chase Miller by his denim jacket, and hauled him toward the exit. You're all Philistines. Chase's voice echoed from the street as he was tossed out. The room burst into laughter. My friends were ecstatic. Ethan, that was brilliant. You really put that bum in his place. The manager sashayed over, beaming. Mr. Sterling, Miss Rose would like to see you now. I straightened my jacket and walked upstairs, followed by the jealous glares of half the men in the room. Lydia's private room was decorated with understated class. Books, a grand piano, and expensive tea. She was even more beautiful up close, with a sharp intelligence in her eyes that Summer completely lacked. "Please, have a seat," she said, pouring tea with practiced grace. "Thank you," I replied, taking a sip. "Miss Rose, that manifesto downstairs was certainly ambitious. Why didn't you choose it?" Lydia smiled, a look of calm wisdom on her face. "You're joking, Mr. Sterling. That piece was linguistically beautiful, yes, but the flaws were staggering. Aside from the nonsensical geography, the way he recited it was all wrong. He stumbled over the rhythm and missed the emotional beats. It didn't sound like he wrote it. It sounded like someone who had memorized a text they didn't actually understand." I was impressed. This woman had a sharp eye. She continued, "I suspect the original was written by a true master of the craft. But for some reason, this Mr. Miller got his hands on it and tried to pass it off as his own without even knowing what the words meant. Why else would someone with that kind of vocabulary fail at basic reading comprehension?" I nodded. Lydia Rose wasn't just a pretty face. "You have a keen eye, Miss Rose," I said. Looking at her, a thought occurred to me. My relationship with Summer was over, and I needed someone intelligent and capable by my side. Lydia was educated, knew how to handle a crowd, and clearly understood the world. "Miss Rose," I said, setting my cup down, "would you be interested in leaving this place? I could use a personal assistant, or more, if things work out." Lydia froze. Then a look of pure, shocked hope crossed her face. She stood up and gave a graceful bow. "If you would have me, Mr. Sterling, it would be my honor. You have no idea what this means to me." Her reaction was expected. For me, it was just hiring a talented person. For her, it was a ticket out of the nightlife and back into high society. I was a Sterling. Being associated with me was a massive step up. That night, well, it was a very productive evening. The next day, I had my assistant handle the paperwork to clear her contracts and move her into a private apartment I kept in the city. When my father heard I'd hired a club singer, he just shrugged. "Just keep it professional and don't let it interfere with the family business," he said. To him, it was like I bought a new car. It didn't matter as long as it wasn't the main wife. I thought the whole situation was settled. I didn't realize the best part was yet to come. The very next day, Summer Harrison showed up at my office again. She stormed in, shouting, "Ethan, did you use your influence at the Moonlight Lounge to cheat Chase out of his victory?" I was drinking some high-end espresso. I nearly choked. "Summer, what are you talking about? It was a public competition. Everyone saw it." "You're lying," she cried. "Chase told me. He wrote a legendary masterpiece, and you and that woman ganged up on him. You're just jealous of his soul. You need to go public right now and admit that his manifesto was better than your trash." I looked at her. She looked like a complete idiot. "Summer, whether he stole it or not is one thing. But the poem was full of nonsense places, and he couldn't even read it correctly. Only someone as blinded as you would believe him." "You're just cruel. You're a liar," she screamed. "Chase is the real deal. You're just a lowlife with a big bank account." I lost my patience. Once or twice was fine, but this constant harassment and her insulting my character for a guy she barely knew, that was the line. Enough. I slammed my hand on the desk, standing up. My Sterling family authority came out in full force. "Summer, watch your mouth. Who do you think you're talking to? I have worked for everything I have, and I don't need to steal from a hack. If your Chase is so talented, let him get a real job and prove it, instead of reciting gibberish to drunk people." Summer flinched, shocked by my sudden anger. She took a step back, but still tried to play the martyr. You're a bully. I'm telling the truth." "The truth?" I sneered. "Fina, if you want to be stubborn, I'm done being polite. I call my secretary. Call Arthur Harrison. Tell him exactly what his daughter has been doing and saying in my office. Ask him to come pick up his child." Summer turned pale. "Ethan, you wouldn't. I didn't even look at her. Get her out of here." Summer was practically dragged out by security. The next day, Arthur Harrison and his wife arrived at my office with a mountain of expensive gifts, apologizing profusely. Arthur was a smart man. He knew the cost of offending the Sterling family. He swore he would handle his daughter, but apparently he couldn't. The word was that after she got home, the Harrisons tried everything, talks, grounding her, even threatening to cut her off. But Summer was too far gone. She had a massive blowout with her parents, threw a vase, and screamed, "You only hate Chase because he's poor. I don't care about your money. I'm going to marry him. I'd rather starve with him than live in this house." I laughed when I heard the news. Arthur and his wife finally snapped. Fearing her behavior would ruin the family's reputation, they officially announced that Summer Harrison was being disowned. Effective immediately, she was cut off from the family fortune and her name was removed from the trust. They had plenty of other kids. They didn't need one who was intent on burning the house down. Once that happened, I knew the time was right. I met with my parents and explained the whole situation, how Summer had been brainwashed, how she'd insulted us, and how her own father had kicked her out. My father, the DA, was furious. A merchant's daughter acting like that? The Sterling name won't be dragged through the mud. Ethan, in it, do it publicly so the city knows it was her fault. So, a formal announcement was made. The engagement was off. I returned the Harrison family's traditional gifts with a cold, professional note. Arthur had to swallow his pride and send more gifts to apologize for the embarrassment. As for Summer, I heard that after she was kicked out, she took a single suitcase and some pocket change and moved into a tiny, dilapidated studio with her great artist. I sat in my office garden, drinking tea served by Lydia Rose, watching the sunset. Life was good. A girl who didn't know the first thing about real life, paired with a genius who couldn't even plagiarize a poem properly. What kind of inspiring love story were they going to write now? The scandal died down after a while. The city moved on to laughing at the Harrison girl who ran off with a bum. I lived my best life, studying for my next career move, enjoying the company of the sophisticated Lydia, and hanging out with my friends. News about Chase Miller still trickled in. He was still at it. Anywhere there was a crowd, he was there, shouting, pioneering poetry. One day, it was a love poem from the 1800s. The next, it was a modern rap lyric he tried to turn into prose. The variety was insane. It was like he had a library of 1,000 years in his head, but zero context for any of it. People started doubting him more and more. It's fake. He must have found some old book. Maybe he has a ghostwriter. Or maybe he really is a genius who's just unlucky. Every time he recited something, he'd find one or two new believers, people like Summer who were suckers for flowery words. They'd give him a few bucks as patronage, feeling like they were part of something historic. Chase seemed to love it. He never looked for a real job. He just spent his days chasing fame and, well, mostly chasing donations. I heard he even had a couple of young fans following him around, calling him Master Chase. I just laughed. Reputation built on lies is like a sandcastle. One big wave and it's gone. Plus, in the professional world, poetry doesn't pay the bills. If you can't write a coherent report or pass an exam, you're nothing. 10 days passed quickly. It was the day I officially moved Lydia into her new role as my public companion, a soft launch of our new arrangement. While it wasn't a wedding, being the partner of a sterling heir was a huge deal. My mother, seeing Lydia's background, had taken a liking to her and helped her pick out a wardrobe of designer dresses and jewelry. I even threw a small party to make it official. Lydia was incredibly grateful. To her, this was a dream come true. On the day of the party, we were heading toward the venue in a chauffeured town car. I was feeling great, the classic man on top of the world vibe. But life is full of surprises. As we were stuck in traffic at a major intersection, I saw something moving ahead. It wasn't a large crowd, but it was a scene. What's going on? I asked. Leo, my assistant, looked out and gave a weird, suppressed grin. Sir, it's a wedding. The Harrison girl. She's getting married to that Miller guy today. I stared. No way. I had to see this. It wasn't a wedding so much as a sad parade. Chase Miller was dressed in a cheap, bright red suit that looked like it was made of polyester. He was riding a Vespa, a beat-up old Vespa with a single red ribbon tied to the handlebars. The bride, Summer, was sitting on the back, holding on to him. She was wearing a dress that was clearly a knockoff. The fabric looked thin and dull. Behind them followed a handful of people who looked like they'd just come from a construction site, likely Chase's relatives from some remote town he'd never mentioned. No band, no flowers, just a few cheap party poppers being set off. It was pathetic. Our Blacktown car, sleek and expensive, pulled up right alongside them. My driver honked, and the procession had to pull over to let us pass. The Vespa sputtered and stalled, and Chase almost tipped over, looking incredibly clumsy. Summer looked up. She was wearing makeup, but it couldn't hide how tired and stressed she looked. When she saw me, sitting in the back of a luxury car, dressed in a custom suit, with a beautiful Lydia Rose beside me, her eyes went through a whole range of emotions. Anger, pride, humiliation, and maybe, just maybe, a flash of regret she wouldn't admit to. She glared at me, her voice shrill as she shouted over the traffic. Ethan Sterling, don't look down on us. Chase is a real genius. He's going to be famous. One day, you'll be begging for his autograph. You'll regret this 100 times over. She was screaming to convince herself. She needed to believe her sacrifice was worth it. Chase, regaining his balance on a Vespa, puffed out his chest and shouted in that weirdly confident voice, "Oomph. Don't waste your breath on these corporate ghouls, Summer. Heaven gave me talent, and it must be used. When I'm at the top, We'll see who the real hero is. I sat there, looking at this pair of fools. One screaming from a cheap scooter, the other clutching her pride in a knockoff dress. It was a beautiful disaster. Are you two even eating regularly? I wondered. Heaven gave you talent? By stealing from people in another dimension? Good luck with that. I suddenly felt bored. Engaging with people who live in delusions is just a waste of energy. I didn't even say a word. I just signaled my driver to keep going. The car pulled away smoothly, the music from our high-end sound system drowning out their shouting. We passed them like a tidal wave passing a pebble. Behind us, I could hear Summer's faint crying and Chase's awkward attempts to comfort her. The sun was shining, and the day was perfect. Leo leaned over. Sir, they look like a mess. Do you want me to have someone? Keep an eye on them? Make sure they don't cause trouble. I shook my head. Why bother? I have a party to get to. Let them enjoy their true love. Life after that was incredibly smooth. Without Summer's drama, my days were peaceful. I spent my time working, eventually landing a high-ranking position in the city administration. Lydia was the perfect partner, graceful, intelligent, and a great hostess for the events I had to attend. I'd occasionally hear updates about Chase and Summer from my friends. It was the favorite gossip at our weekend brunches. Ethan, you won't believe it, Mark said one day, laughing over his mimosa. My manager saw the Harrison girl the other day. She's thin as a rail, looking completely drained. She was at a discount grocery store, arguing with the clerk over a coupon for 50 cents. Can you imagine? Another friend chimed in. That's nothing. I heard she's tried to go back to the Harrison estate 3 times. The first time, they gave her some cash and told her to leave. The second time, they wouldn't even open the gate. The third time, they called the cops to have her trespassed. Arthur is done with her. Serves her right, someone muttered. She chose the starving artist life. Now she's just starving. I just listened, feeling a weird sense of satisfaction. It was like watching a movie where the ending was already written. And what about the genius? I asked. Mark slapped his knee. Oh, Chase is a joke. There was a poetry reading at the university last week. He tried to crash it again, but the organizers were ready. They told him that if he wanted to read, he had to write a poem on a whiteboard in front of everyone to prove it was original. And he turned green. Mark laughed. He claimed he had a hand injury, but the crowd started heckling him, so he had to try. My God, Ethan, the guy writes like a toddler. He couldn't even form the letters correctly. Half the words were misspelled, and his handwriting was like a serial killer's manifesto. He's probably never even finished high school. I smiled. I knew exactly why. He couldn't write the formal script of our world. A guy who can't even spell masterpiece but claims to have written one? It was only a matter of time before the world caught on. Years passed. 5 years, then 10. I stayed focused. I worked hard, used my family's influence wisely, and eventually became the mayor of the city. I married a woman from another prominent political family, Madeline Vance. She was elegant, smart, and a perfect match for my ambitions. Lydia remained a close friend and confidant, well taken care of in her own right. Occasionally, I'd see Chase's name in the local where they now columns. He had become a local legend for all the wrong reasons. The genius who never was. He'd failed every certification exam he'd ever taken. People didn't even mock him anymore. They just felt sorry for him. 10 years is a long time. It's enough for a young man to become a leader of a city. My father had moved up to a state-level position, and I was now the one in charge. One afternoon, I was doing a casual walkthrough of the Fairhaven district, a poorer part of the city, to check on some new development projects. I was dressed in plain clothes, accompanied only by 2 plainclothes security officers. As I walked, I heard a sharp, screaming match coming from the gate of a large, slightly faded mansion. It was the old Harrison estate. I looked over, and my heart skipped a beat. If it weren't for the eyes, I wouldn't have recognized her. It was Summer. She was gone. The vibrant, pretty girl from 10 years ago was replaced by a woman who looked like a ghost. She was skeletal, her face sallow and lined with stress. Her hair was thin and messily tied back. She was wearing a dress that had been patched so many times you couldn't tell the original color. And it got worse. She was holding a toddler who looked malnourished, and 2 other young children were clutching at her tattered skirt. All 3 kids looked terrified. The front door of the Harrison mansion was open, and an older woman, who I realized was Summer's mother, was standing on the porch, screaming, "You ungrateful brat! You're a curse on this family!" "Mrs. Harrison screamed, her face twisted with bitterness. "We almost lost everything because of you. Do you have any idea what it did to us when you broke that engagement? If the Sterlings hadn't been so gracious, we would have been blacklisted from every bank in the state." She stopped to catch her breath. "Your sister's engagement was called off because of your reputation. You ruined her life." I don't have a daughter. Get out of here. If I see you again, I'm calling the police. With a final look of disgust, Mrs. Harrison slammed the heavy oak door. The sound echoed like a gunshot. Summer stood there, staring at the closed door. She didn't scream back. She just stood there as silent tears tracked through the dirt on her face. Her shoulders shook with a deep, hopeless grief. The kids started crying softly, huddled around her legs. It was a scene of pure, unadulterated misery, but the universe wasn't finished. A tall, thin man in a dirty old coat came around the corner. It was Chase Miller. He looked ancient. His back was hunched, and the arrogance he once had turned into a bitter, violent frustration. He saw Summer crying, and his face contorted with rage. He didn't offer a hand. He just started yelling, "You useless bitch. I told you to get money from them. You came back empty-handed? How are we supposed to pay the rent? What good are you?" Summer snapped. 10 years of resentment finally boiled over. She looked at him with eyes full of hatred. "I am useless. What about you, Chase? 10 years. You've had 10 years to do something. You haven't even kept a job at a gas station. I was so stupid to believe you were some genius. You're just a pathetic, lying hack who can't even write a coherent sentence. You're a loser." That was the one thing he couldn't stand to hear. His face went white, then purple. "Shut up. If I hadn't married a worthless anchor like you, I'd be a star. Your bad luck ruined my career. You're the reason I'm like this. You're the reason. You lied to me. You ruined my life." Summer screamed, dropping the toddler and lunging at him like a wild animal. Chase grabbed her by the hair, and Summer scratched at his face. They fell in the dirt right there on the sidewalk, in front of the mansion, screaming and fighting like animals. They traded blows and insults, completely devoid of any dignity. The children were screaming on the sidelines. Passers-by stopped to watch, some laughing, some recording it on their phones. I stood at the corner, watching the spectacle. 10 years. That's all it took to turn a romantic hero and his muse into two bitter people clawing at each other in the mud. One of my security guards couldn't help it. He let out a snort, then quickly covered his mouth, looking at me with wide, apologetic eyes. "Sorry, sir. I couldn't hold it in." I looked at the couple in the dirt and felt a small, cold smile touch my lips. "It's all right," I said quietly. "It is hard to watch. The last bit of resentment I'd held for Summer for all those years ago vanished. I didn't even feel the need to mock them. They were doing a better job of that themselves than I ever could. They were a perfect match, after all, and they deserved to stay in that mud together for the rest of their lives." Story complete.